All right, let's get started. So good evening, everybody. It's so good to have you join us. I'm Matt Molina. I'm the director and founder of NYC H2O. I'm so excited to be presenting Lina Zeldovich, journalist and author of The Other Dark Matter. She is based here in New York City, which I'm also proud of because our organization is NYC H2O. And also helping us tonight is Chelsea, my colleague Chelsea from NYC H2O, will help us manage the chat and make things run smoothly. So for those of you who are new to NYC H2O, we are a nonprofit organization based here in New York City. All of our work is done here in New York City. We provide environmental education programs by getting kids, mostly from underserved communities, outside into city parks, which are incredible, teaching them about New York's water system and water ecology. Along with that, we help to steward the parks where we bring the kids. And we encourage you to join us for a future program in a park or a beach. There are lots of beautiful parks and beaches that we help to take care of, and all that information is on our website. I want to thank all our H2O members, many of whom are joining us tonight. Thank you for your generous support that keeps us going and allows programs like this, which are timely and important topics that don't often get much coverage, but still, very important part of our civic discourse to allows it to happen. I'd also like to thank the H2O board for their generosity, in particular our board president, Peter Frischhoff, and his partner, Casey Rice and Froma Harrop, who consistently help support us and keep us going as the rest of our board. So this topic, recycling sewage and to use the industry lingo, the beneficial reuse of biosolids is quite timely for a number of reasons. The first of which is on just this past Friday, the City Council's Committee on Environmental Protection, which helps to oversee the Department of Environmental Protection, which is the name of our water utility and sewage treatment utility in New York City, had its preliminary budget hearings. In that hearing, it was discussed that for New York City as a whole, we recycle only 39% of our human waste, of our sewage. And that needs to be considered a big part of our organic recycling stream. And for some reason it's not, but that's a large amount of organic material that really needs to be recycled, and only 39% is. So this is a timely subject. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce our featured speaker tonight, Lina Zeldovich, an accomplished journalist who's been published in many major publications and writes about the intersection of humanity and its role with ecology and vice versa. And so without further ado, please join me in welcoming Lina. Lina, please.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for having me. I'm really proud and excited to be talking to my New York City community. So usually I do these talks as just conversations. But in this particular case, I put together a presentation as Matt asked me. However, because I am a storyteller, I am going to start with a story. Let me share my screen. Okay, Matt, can you see it?
Yes.
All good? Okay, perfect. So please welcome to my presentation called Feces, the Final Frontier. Please maintain your sense of humor through the conversation. We're going to be talking about some things that I think are impossible to talk about without humor. So without further ado, I'm going to jump into the story. Once upon a time, in a kingdom far, far away in China, there was an emperor of the Qing dynasty. Here he is. And one day in 1737, the emperor looked to the south half of his kingdom and was pleased to see that the cities were thriving and clean, and the farmlands were plentiful and fertile. But then he looked to the north and saw the exact opposite. The cities were dirty and the land was filthy. And when he looked closer, he understood why. Apparently, in the south, the residents have been able to collect their excrement and take it out of the city and take it to the farmland to use as fertilizer. That has not happened in the north. So the emperor put out a treatise in which he wrote, "The street in the north are not clean. The land is filthy. Every household should collect night soil." Night soil meant excrement. The title of the treatise was as plain as it was poetic. It was called "Treasure Night Soil as if it were gold." That is a fun story, but it is also true. You can actually read more about it if you'd like in this book. It's called The Good Muck Toward an Excremental History of China. And it was written by an environmental historian. And his name is Donald Worster. He's now retired, but the book is out there if anybody's interested. What's really interesting is why is Southerners were better at the night soil business than the Northerners. And when I looked into this when I was working on the book. So the southern part of the country, at least at the time, had a lot of big cities. In particular, one of them, I'm going to butcher the name, called Hangzhou. It was a big urban sprawl and a big seaport, and one of the largest cities on earth at the time. By 1820s, it was over 3 million people. And there were other big cities on the Yangtze River Delta that had 6 million people and 3 million people. On comparison, the municipality of ancient Rome had 500,000 to 1 million people at its height. 6 million is about as many people as Rome had today. What, like half of like New York City or something. And all these people had to be fed, and their metabolic output had to be taken out. And so the Southerners perfected that business. They really knew how to do it. By the way, the name night soil derives from the fact that the residents would put out the chamber pots out the door early morning, and the service would go through the city and collect them. So here's the next slide. So here's night soil. Oops, too quick. So these are the night soil gatherers. So here on the right side, you can actually see how they loaded up these little buckets into the gondolas. And here's the lady who just collected a couple of those buckets, and she's taking it wherever. Called Fin Fu, this night soil middleman wheeled their carts through the city streets, collecting waste in buckets like this. They could hold about 60 pounds each, and they would load them up into carts, 6 to 10 of them, accumulating 600-pound total. And then they would take them to the port, load them up into gondolas, and sail them to the countryside. They were very efficient. They had their daily routes, the best way to ferret muck out of the city, how to find buyers. They sailed it out to the country, covered in straw to keep out the stink. They brought the dung to the large empty lots outside the city and processed it. They spread it, dried it, and sorted it. Notably, not all shit was created equal. The offerings of the elite sold to the highest bidder because they were supposedly having better diets. Their food was more diverse, and so their poo had more nutrients in it. The poor people dung sold for less, and at the very bottom of that hierarchy was manure collected from pigs and other animals. I must admit, when I was reading all this, I kind of wondered if there were counterfeit poo at the time, if people tried to, sell pig manure as human manure. But they probably were. They probably really knew how shit was supposed to look. Maybe they could tell. Interestingly, the Chinese were not the only ones who treasured poo. In the pre-industrial Japan, the value of night soil was in fact measured in gold. The price of night soil produced by 10 households in a year was worth half a riyal of gold. And to put that in perspective, 1 riyal could buy all the grain needed to feed one person for a year. A system of regulations governed the night soil business, delving into details unimaginable by our standards. For example, if a family rented a house, who had the rights to the excrement produced by them? You would think, and I would think, that the tenants should have been the proud owners of their poo, but no, that treasure belonged to the landlord, who sold it to the middleman, who then sold it to farmers. And interestingly, the more people lived in a house, let's say 6 versus 4, the cheaper was the rent, because the landlord could recover that money by selling their metabolic output. Farmers fought who got to collect excrement and where. For example, in the literature that I was putting together for the book, I read that in summer of 1924, 2 groups of villages nearby Osaka erupted in poop wars, fighting over the rights to collect night soil from different parts of the city. And so the cities decided to form their own organizations to oversee waste disposal and price negotiation, and they raised prices on their poo. So the less fortunate farmers who couldn't afford it were in trouble. That led to a crime unfathomable by our standards: stealing shit. By Japanese canons, it was a very serious offense. It's so serious, in fact, that the law enforcement entities punished the felons by sending them to prison. And yet that didn't stop the desperate farmers from committing this stinky crime, because not having enough fertilizer could completely devastate a family. So excrement theft was a real threat. So farmers actually stored it in bulletproof containers. So, it was of high value. Europeans had no use for it whatsoever, so they treated it like shit. Why so? Well, we'll get in a little bit, but I found some really funny examples. So medieval Berliners piled their shit in front of St. Peter's Cathedral until a 1600s law directed every visiting peasant to take a load home. So it was in reverse. Paris was a mess because Parisians emptied their chamber pots out the window in a method infamously dubbed as two à la rue, all into the street. And in Victorian England, sewage emptied directly into the Thames, which caused the great stink of London, to which we will actually return. So why such an incredibly stark difference? The answer was quite literally buried in the ground, or rather in the soil. A European farmer, Europeans geographically happen to be in a better, in a more fertile land. They had forests, they had meadows. They could always clear some patch of land and plant their crops there. And this is what we generally expect. When we clear a patch of land, we expect the soil to be good for a few years, and then it starts getting not so good. But farmers in Japan and parts of China had a very different situation. They had very little arable land and a lot of poor sandy soils. So Japan was a little country spread over a few small islands, and it had a lot of mountains, and it just didn't have enough good soil. It also didn't have enough meadows where you can let cattle graze. And when you don't have cattle, you also don't have cattle manure. So with that and soil and sandy, like nutrient poor soil, crops wouldn't grow so well. So that's why the Japanese saying actually said, a new field gives but a small crop. So instead, this societies used excrement. So the Japanese call it shimagori, which literally meant fertilizer from the bottom of a person. Okay, let's see. Next slide. So the fundamental difference in sanitation. So in China and Japan, farmers paid a pretty penny to secure valuable fertilizer. In Europe, the sanitation economy was in reverse. They paid to remove disgusting filth. So their efforts focused on eliminating excrement as quickly and efficiently as possible. And the most efficient way of eliminating excrement was the toilet. Toilets have an interesting history. They actually originated, the real modern day toilets originated, as you might know, in Great Britain. And the person who first built it was actually not an engineer. He was a poet. The first flushing toilet was designed by Sir John Harrington, a cousin of Queen Elizabeth, and then later perfected by Thomas Crapper, who was an engineer. And so, what actually happened is that Harrington was somehow banished from the palace, and he had to go into exile in Bath, apparently for some not so polite poems that he was writing. And while there, he decided to trade his spend for plumbing tools and build the first modern flushing toilets, where there's pipes coming in and pipes coming out and a little bit of a lever. So that was his first contraption. The Queen visited him a few months later, checked out the construction, supposedly used it, liked it, and wanted one for herself in her palace. So he built it for her. And then things kind of took a little while. Things were slow back then. It took about 200 years for it to get actually to a more or less modern version that we know that looked like this. And that model was marketed by Thomas Crapper. And now you know why it's called, taking a crap. We have to thank Thomas Crapper, the engineer, who made it available. An interesting thing happened afterwards. Once the toilet worked and was affordable for the higher society to install it, everybody wanted it. Having an indoor toilet became a sign of an upper status. Not only was having it utterly convenient, but it made the ruling elite appear nearly godlike. Not only their shit didn't stink, but it looked like they didn't even produce it. They no longer needed chamber pots. They no longer needed servants to empty it. And so everybody wanted one. But where did all this shit go? Well, into the Thames. It was just a slight upgrade from onto the street. It was all into the Thames. So not surprisingly, it only took a little while for the Thames to stink. And this is what caused the infamous stink of London, which actually happened multiple times throughout history. And I'd like to read to you, a passage from the book. Basically, the situation got so bad that a group of high status official was sent to investigate the matter. Exactly how badly was the river polluted? So this aristocratic, group of people got onto the boat and sailed up the river. The commissioners bravely undertook an expedition up the river, peering into its dark currents and the various objects that floated along. Charged with identifying exactly how far the sewage spread, this aristocratic coterie of sirs, lords, and otherwise prominent and respectable officials in tweed suits went onto the Thames boat cruise, holding up their pince-nez and pointing fingers at the questionable materials below. In fact, the committee's report said in the beginning of the journey, the sewage was so thick that they were actually looking for the glimpses of water in it. The gentleman who actually led this committee was Lord Bramwell. So he wrote in his report that up to Greenwich, it appeared unmixed sewage. Then patches of natural water appeared, natural water. Imagine that, which increased till the sewage ended, Lord Bramwell said in his report. We traced the sewage all the way to the Limehouse, he wrote, ending that the offensive matters could also easily reach the London Bridge. He also wrote that the public interest requires that a remedy should be applied with the least possible delay. And what remedy did they choose? I was looking for the pictures of these boats that they actually hired to dump the sewage into the sea. I couldn't find any credible ones or the ones that didn't have copyright. So I just wrote you the answer. They hired 2 massive boats and send them to dump the sewage into the sea. What I thought was interesting is that it's not that they didn't really understand the value of their shit. They did. They just didn't know how to handle it. They actually, they appreciated London's sewage manurial value. They wrote that no one doubts that it's a general principle, the value of human manure for fertilizing land. They even put a price tag on it. They wrote that the output of 4 million people, is worth, so much and so much. They just didn't know how to deal with it. And I couldn't help thinking that if only the thrifty, Chinese and Japanese, fan food people knew that there was, basically money being given out in England in the form of shimagaya, that would probably sail there and brought it back. They might have even established a trade, not the Silk Road, but more like the shipping trade or something like that. Well, 3 centuries later, almost 3 centuries, we still haven't figured out how to deal with our shit. And what I generally talk a lot in the book about is what scientists call the metabolic rift, also called the redistribution of nutrients on the planet. So this is what happens. So when you go to a store and you look at where your food comes from, it's a lot of it comes from afar. A lot of it comes from other location, which means it grew someplace, someplace in California or Florida or South America. Growing there, that food extracted nutrients from the land. It is then flown or trucked or shipped to us, and we eat it here. It grew someplace else, but we eat it here, and we excrete it here also. Where does it all go? Well, it depends on where you live, but generally what happens here is, biosolids might, the water is clean and released into the environment. Biosolids, this kind of a sticky issue, depends again where you live. But what happens with that water, it is clean, it's pathogen free, and a lot of places you could drink it, so it's so clean. But it still has its fertilizing potential. It is still high on nitrogen, it is still high on phosphorus, it is still high on potassium, because this is what our poo naturally is high on, and urine. So all these fertilizing elements flow into some body of water, a river, lake, ultimately the ocean. And what do there? They fertilize all the wrong things. They fertilize the algae that grows out of control, and eventually it smothers the lakes and rivers. It does the same in the ocean. It also this over fertilization causes the destruction of coastal marshes, because the marshes overgrow, and when they overgrow, the plants grow tall, but the roots stay very weak because there's too much food. There's no need to grow strong roots. And marshes begin to fall apart because it is the roots of all these marsh grasses that hold the marshes together. And why is it bad that marshes fall apart? Because they protect us from from floods that are like super important in the 21st century. They also serve as nurseries for food, for fish, that like little fish, juvenile fish grows there before it swims out of the ocean. Coastal marshes are very important, and if we don't somehow change this problem, we're just gonna make it worse and worse. So what do I mean when I say, here's a good illustration to that the metabolic rift. So this is how it should be. We eat, we excrete, it goes to the soil in the form of compost, and then food grows again. What we do with our current infrastructure is this: it's broken. So we pollute the waterways, and then to keep our our land fertile, we put chemical fertilizer. And I'm sure, as many of you know, it's also not a good thing. Food is less nutritious, and also producing chemical fertilizer is not only expensive, but it takes fossil fuels. It's very polluting. It produces this infamous NOx gases that contribute to acid rain and whatnot. So here's the next slide. This is 300 years later. This is what's happening in New York City. I'm sure New York City had a poop repurposing plant, but it was closed because, well, it stunk. So I think starting from 2018, we've been sending at least some of our poop to a small Alabama town. Washington Post did a story in 2018 that, with the title, "A Poop Train from New York Befouled a Small Alabama Town Until the Town Fought Back." It looked like it stopped for a little while. I don't know what New York City did in the meantime, but now the poop train is back. It almost sounds like it's a good movie title in the series, "The Poop Train Returns." So it is returning. There are more articles coming out. One of them was called "New York Poop Train Rolling into Alabama Town Again," and people aren't happy. Of course, they aren't happy. Who wants other people's poop, except the ancient societies in China and Japan? And this kind of brings us to this, conundrum. Like, everybody has to go to the bathroom. So what do? We're talking about colonizing Mars, but we can't get together, our shit here on Earth. So how do we solve this conundrum? So what I talk in the book about is that, we solve the number 2 problem with number 1, technology, and number 2, education, aka awareness, aka destigmatizing poop. I think part of the reason for our aversion to that other dark matter that we produce is because it's very specifically instilled in us as we grow up. We learn that it's very dangerous. It harbors disease. We should keep it as far away from it as possible. But modern technologies can actually minimize a lot of disease factors and turn it into compostable and usable fertilizer. And in order for it to happen on a larger scale, we have to start, we as a society not just New York society or American society, more like Western society, have to start thinking about it differently. So talking about technologies, I gathered a few good examples here. The first one, I'm sure you know, this is the famous silver egg digesters of Newtown Creek plant, where the output of this is basically compostable fertilizer and biogas, which they are not using right now. They're just flaring it and burning it for internal purposes, but it could, in theory, channel into Con Edison pipeline, and they're working on it. The one here in the lower right-hand corner is by a company listed based in Canada, but their method is being used in other places, being adopted. So what you're looking at here is actually not a digester. You're looking at a massive blender. So part of the problem with sewage is that it's hard to deal with. It's kind of liquidy and chunky. You can't pump it. It has to flow like water or oil. So what this blender does, it basically whips it into a form of, their creators called it a sewage smoothie, and out comes something quite manageable. You can pump it into tanks, you can pump it into trucks, and that's exactly what they do. They pump it into trucks, take it to the countryside, they inject it into the soil. So far, they use it mostly for things like grass for cows and fruit trees, not so much for berries and other things, but hey, it's still a reuse of an important resource. So up here in the upper corner, there's a home biogas. It's a really interesting creation, and it's by an Israeli company, Biogas. So the one that you're looking at here is their earlier model. It was created for composting food leftovers kind of quickly and efficiently. So in goes food, out comes kind of like liquidly fertilizer and biogas. But their newer model connects to a biotoilet. Why biotoilet specifically? Because biotoilets don't use a lot of water. The water is always an issue. Like, what are you going to do with it? It's too much. So these models are actually excellent for people wanting to live off the grid, because they're incredibly cheap, like maybe $700, and they pay for themselves pretty quickly in the form of biogas that you can cook with. Here in the lower left-hand corner, you can see little words epic, and the full thing didn't fit here. So this is Epic Cleantech. It's based in San Francisco. So this model works at the level of an apartment building or an office building. So it goes, it's like a plug-in, like a big cartridge that plugs right before the sewage leaves the building and goes to the sewage plant. And then it separates water from the rest. Water is clean and recycled as a gray water within the building. And the biosolids are converted into fertilizer. They have their own proprietary method. The one in the middle up on top here was my favorite. This is a wastewater plant in Washington, D.C. You can see little words here, letters here, D.C. So this is a really, really cool thing, because what happens here is that the sewage comes in, it is loaded into pressure cookers. It's big columns here, they're pressure cookers, and they cook this sludge. I forget the exact, something like 600 degrees Fahrenheit and 6 times the pressure. No, it's 300 degrees Fahrenheit and 6 times the atmospheric pressure. So when that sludge comes out, there's nothing left alive on there. And then it goes into biodigesters, and then it gets biodigested. The biogas is extracted. The plant actually uses that gas to run those pressure cookers. And what comes out is kind of basically black mud. So what they do after that is they squeeze all the water out of it, dry it some, and they package it into this organic fertilizer called bloom. So that bloom feels and smells just like garden dirt, like that awesome garden dirt that every gardener wants in their garden because it's so clear, it's going to be so fertile, it's going to grow awesome vegetables. The flowers are going to bloom and grow big. It was so pleasant actually to dig into it when I was at the plant. So if I was living in DC, I would be buying it. Next to it is a similar version, actually much older version. It's called Milorganite, and it's made in Milwaukee, slightly different technology. It's kind of, heated and dried, not, pressure cooked, but out basically comes a very similar substance. And they've been doing it for some like 90 years. I don't know why it never caught, it was never sort of, this technology never really won in any other places. But my point is, the technologies exist. We can make it work. I think the biggest challenge is sort of acceptance on a society's level that this is all cool stuff. And that brings us to the next point. None of these technologies, this awesome tech, will be fully accepted and loved until we change how we think about metabolic output. We must stop seeing poop as disgusting filth that must be disposed of. We have to see it for what it's worth, an incredibly versatile, important, fully renewable resource that all 7 billion of us on this planet produce with remarkable regularity, not daily, about a pound a day. So the way I look at it, and that's why I wrote this book, is that poop's got an image problem. It needs some TLC. It needs PR work. It needs the same love and acceptance as it enjoyed in China and Japan. And so what I would like to leave you all with is with this. All of you people are super poopers. You don't go to the bathroom to take a bowel movement or take a dump. You go there to produce an incredibly valuable substance. There. This is who you are. This is what we all are. The planet needs it. The soil needs it. The food won't grow without it. The cultivars won't bear crop. The circular economy won't work. The circle of life won't work. So what you produce really isn't waste. It is people's own organic power of poop. We kind of all know this. So this is what the acronym stands for. So this is the first step, changing the mindset. So humans love their shit and treasure it as if it were gold. If there's anything I'd love to leave you with tonight after this conversation, it's that. And don't let anyone tell you it's all just crap. I'm gonna stop sharing the screen and open it up for questions.
That was great. So I learned so much. Thank you, Lina.
You're welcome.
It was so interesting to learn about the night soil industry in China and how the larger households were charged less rent because their poop was so valuable.
Yeah.
Fascinating. I visited the New York State Museum up in Albany, and they have an exhibit, and part of that exhibit is about the night soil collectors here in the city in the 19th century. So at one time we did practice, recycling sewage, and we do it to a small extent now, but obviously we have a lot more that we need to do. So I know that I have a few questions. I will ask one, but I want to encourage participation by our audience. So so please, if you have a question, you can type it in the chat. You can also raise your hand, and we'll be happy to call on you. And Chelsea, if you could help me just to monitor the chat, that'd be helpful. While we're waiting for folks to think of their questions, and if you do have a question, just you could either raise your hand like on the Zoom screen, or you can take yourself off of mute. But because you had presented a slide about the poop train again, and I hadn't seen that article, and that was from 2022. That there had been previous versions of that years ago.
Yeah.
Because this is more than a regional problem, do you see part of the solution requiring federal legislation of organic waste?
I mean, that's a great question. I guess it will be good to have. To be honest, I don't really see it happening. I think people are so not ready for something like this. I think a lot of people would feel that, you know, now they're being policed in their, you know, poop habits. And frankly speaking, it didn't always, work. When you sort of like try to push it onto people from above, it doesn't necessarily work. Because in some parts of my book, I talk about things, such, I think it was probably end of 19th century. There was actually a push to establish better sanitary practices in Indian reservation, and several thousands of young women were hired to go there and train, the women there on how to do it right. Basically telling them, don't do it under a tree, build a latrine. And people didn't want to do it. They didn't want to go into latrine. Latrines were ugly and dirty. Going under a tree was actually a lot cleaner. That's how they saw it. So they protested, they resisted. I think in something so personal, I think it's changing the mindset. It's kind of, finding, I'm going to say, beauty in this whole, circular economy. It's understanding that we're part of this really beautiful circle of nature. It is within us, and I think it should come, from within first, and then people will want, this to work that way. And at that point, I think we can, think of, regulations. Yeah, some kind of a unified method.
Interesting. So we have some questions from the audience. Parker asks, are there issues with using the recycled sewage that results from the metabolic processes and of what's left over from people taking medications and
that is actually one tricky question. So there are a couple of ways to think about it. So when a lot of substances would break down when you cook them at high temperatures and pressures, so they will be broken down to molecules that are not harmful anymore. There are some things that may not, and in this case, there should be chemical waste to sort of pull them out. But even, PFAS, those, infamous chemicals, would break down under enough, pressure and high temperatures. So probably the way to go would be just, cooking shit, longer and stronger. And probably using some chemicals to pull out what you can break.
Great. Craig asks, availability of land, potential transmission of pathogens, odor control seem to be among the top challenges of processing poop within the dense urban environment. What are some of the steps that we can take to
Yeah.
address these challenges?
Yeah, so pathogens is, again, you cook it. The system that was in DC, the reason I like it so much, it was actually incredibly inexpensive, at the municipal scale. And they brought it over from Europe, where it's actually widely used. I don't remember the exact number because I don't want to say it, but compare it to the the cost of sort of your average municipal sewage disposal system, it's actually inexpensive. That's what they told me. They went with it because their budget was cut, and turned out they found something better. So pathogens, yes, cooking is the answer. High temperatures, high pressure, nothing survives that. Nothing alive. Smell, oh yeah, that's true too. Smell disappears with digesting. After the stuff sits in biodigesters for a while, when it comes out, it smells just like dirt. It smells like forest floor. It smells like mud. And those to humans are not as offensive. They're more natural. That's why DC was my favorite. Out comes garden dirt. Like, I can just take it and put it in my garden, and it doesn't smell bad. It actually smells pleasant.
And I think it's important to point out that you can use the biogas from the sewage treatment plant to actually run that extra process of cooking the poop.
Yeah.
So Casey asks, I have a wonderful composting toilet in the country, my own local garden fertilizer. Are composting toilets being considered by sewage recycling advocates?
Yes. So the home biogas that I talked about, they have a combo of a toilet and this little miniature tank that you can run. It's on a family level, so it works like perfectly for your folks who want to live off the grid, and for somebody who is in the country, it absolutely works. Can something like this work on a larger scale? I don't know, maybe on the village scale, but probably not on a city scale. Yeah.
Okay.
I think the solution is really, depending on where you are, like, whether you live in a city, in a building, or in the country, you're going to end up with somewhat different solutions.
Makes sense. A question from Dana. Do manufacturers of chemical fertilizers see this as a threat to their business? And are farmers willing to change over to fertilizer sourced from humans?
That is an awesome question, especially the first one. I'd love to know. Probably at this point, not yet. It's still fairly small. It's so much in its infancy. But I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, maybe I'm thinking of them too highly. I don't know. Are farmers willing to change? Some. The organic farmers are definitely open to it, and I think some are working with some of the sewage processing facilities that generate output they can use. But it's all sort of like here and few. It works here but not there. Something breaks in the chain. What I see as one of the really big challenges of doing it on a large scale, like I said, technology exists. It's quite often that link. Okay, so here's your DC treatment plant that produces X amount of tons of fertilizer a day. Where does it all go? Where can it all go? In New York City, we produce a whole lot more. How do you get it out of the city? In barges? If yes, where? I mean, can barges sail from here to Florida? I think so. I think they did. I don't know if that's what you saw in that exhibit, Matt, when you went upstate, but I know that there were barges that used to sail from New York to Florida with sheet packed, processed sheet packed, as fertilizer. Can they do this again? I think, why not? I mean, if we have oil tankers shipping oil, then why can't ship tankers ship shit, right? Neither one smells particularly good. People put up with diesel smell. Can we put up with a little bit of a smelly air on some port that takes our sewage out of the city? Maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, something to consider. And again, that's across regions. So that's why I think some kind of federal legislation might be in order.
It might be, yeah, yeah. I mean, how does it work when we're shipping it to Alabama? I don't know. Maybe you know. That's definitely through a couple of states there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a good question. I'm not familiar. Peter asks, how about pet poop? Lots of dogs and cats in the city.
There's no good way to recycle it, right? It goes into this plastic. But that little green contraption that I showed, home biogas, that lets you recycle dog and cat poop. Yeah, you can throw it in and it works. I mean, I think once we get a little bit more advanced, like maybe we have some some of this sewage recycling efforts at like the level of a building, maybe there will be something for the owners where they can sort of add their dog and cat poop to it. I thought someone asked, oh yeah, I see someone put, okay. I wanted to paste put a link here to University of Chicago, and somebody already did. So if you're ordering from University of Chicago Press, use a discount code dark matter, one word, and it's 20% off.
Thank you. That's great. Chelsea, can you type that in? Lina, can you just repeat that again?
Sure, I'll just type it in. So this is the link. Discount code.
Thank you. Beautiful. Okay, there are a few more questions.
Yeah, I'm kind of looking through them.
So yeah, do you want me to call them out, or do you want to go through them?
Go ahead.
Sure. Amit asks, how difficult is the transition of infrastructure? Can existing infrastructure be modified, or would more stuff need to be built to effectively manage the sewage recycling?
That again depends on what level, like at what level you are and what you want to do. So I think what we have in New York City, we probably could add sort of like a step to our existing sewage ponds. We don't have to rebuild so much, although they spend a ton of money, a crazy amount of money on that, on the Newtown Creek, but they kind of build it as, I don't know, the epitome of what you could do. I don't think it has to be that pretty and that epic. I think some existing infrastructure can be used, but if we want to, for example, biodegrade it, then you need to build this big cement tanks in which it sits for a while. I don't know exactly what the rest of New York City plans do, whether they all have that. I don't think so, but maybe. But generally it's sort of like on a case-by-case basis. It's like, how much do you have coming in? How much do you have to process a day? Smaller cities might have an easier way of doing it because they could use something less expensive. Again, smaller cities who are close to the countryside, again, might have it easier, because it's very easy to offload. It just like, it's close. In New York City, just to take anything out of New York City, you have to go through bridges and tunnels, right? So you have to either load it up in trucks or you have to load it up in barges. It's very much on a case-by-case basis. What we need to see again, like people mentality has to start changing. It's not something that we have to destroy. It's something that we have to recycle.
Makes sense. Parker asks, the price of ammonia is spiking due to the lack of natural gas available from Russia. Ammonia is used to create chemical or synthetic fertilizer. With this price spike, is urine for fertilizer more attractive?
I don't know if we've been this long enough for some people to consider it. It's a great, clever question. I love it. So I can tell you that there is a company in South Africa trying to Orion, I think. And so what they did, they actually went more so for the fertilizing potential of urine. They even built this kind of toilet that you have to learn to sit on and position yourself just right so that the number 2 and number 1 get separated and go a separate way. And then they take that separated urine and put it through their proprietary process, and out come this kind of like little granules of ammonia. So even these technologies exist. Honestly, so I never tried that one myself. I haven't gotten to South Africa, but I would be so willing to try it just out of my curiosity, because it seems so simple. We all go through potty training as kids. Can we do a little bit of a potty training as adults? Just out of curiosity, I'd like to do it and see how it works. Seems like a very easy solution.
Yeah, maybe we'll have 2 more questions. Let's see. Leola is asking about the
Yeah, I see that. Are
so
we
that-
forever locked into water flushing toilets, even the places where water shortages? No, we not, and we shouldn't be. So one thing that I didn't get into this talk is how are more, because some progressive startups in Africa and other places where water is really scarce, and also where you can't.
Lina, can I just interrupt you? Can you read the question? Because I didn't have a chance to read it.
Sure, I'm sorry. So are we just forever locked into the water flushing toilets, even in places where there are water shortages? And so the answer is no. So, and here's what. So in places where water is, I'm going to say difficult, and here is why. So there's not enough water, or there's too much water. When you have too much water, your toilet system doesn't work because it overflows all the time, and it causes more problems than not. There are places like that in the world. In the book, I have an entire chapter set in Madagascar, and that island floods all the time, floods to the point where residents of its capital, Antananarivo, grow rice in rice patches outside their homes. It's also a very poor country. There's no question that you can't, lay the infrastructure there that we have here. So they have a completely different approach. It's still in pilot phase, but it's happening. So what they do is they offer a service. So rather than people digging up latrines, which overflow every time it rains, imagine that for a second. So instead of people digging up latrines, they give people sort of like a little enclosure and a toilet, in it. But underneath the toilet is a biodegradable bag that accumulates, all of the input output, and seals it hermetically. It doesn't smell at all. Once the bag fills up, they send a text message to the service. The service comes anyway, but once a week. But if it fills up sooner, they can send a text message, and the service comes in, takes the bag, puts another one in. And the bags are taken to a biodigester, not too far, and it converted into the same substance, biogas and fertilizer. I've actually watched it happen. I've traveled there. I did this service pickup routes with the crew in the sun. Very hard, very difficult, for me. Then they're a little bit better adapted to it. it's hard work for people, but it does provide a very important essential service to society. And people who do this are very proud. It's kind of like it reminded me of this ancient Chinese and Japanese society. It's the same kind of mentality. So can we do this on a slightly, perhaps, higher level? Can we have cartridges underneath our own porcelain jars that go in and out? Once they're full and we put them out the door without the rest of our garbage? Maybe. I could see that some cities that have a lot of issues with water might go that route at some point.
Yeah, fascinating. Wow. That must have been a pretty exciting trip.
Yeah, it was definitely one of the highlights. I have some incredible memories I've learned so much. I was going there, thinking that I'm prepared. I did my research, and once I landed there, I've traveled to poorer countries for my other stories and other reporting, but once I landed there, I realized that I was about 5 years ago. I'm sorry, 500 years ago in human history. What I thought was really interesting is, people enjoy their way of life, but hygienically, it's not sustainable. And so they're trying to find solutions that work for their environment.
Fascinating. How did you make the connection? How did you learn about Madagascar's sewage management?
About that. So I was working on some kind of a technology article. And that was for, so I read about a lot of things. This story was about some sort of new engineering, maybe 3D printers, which like 5 years ago were really hot. And so I think some 3D printing was used in building, some of this, toilets, kind of like maybe the pedestals or something, at least at some point. And this is how I learned about that company. And then I started looking into the company more specifically, and I realized what they do. I think my first thought was, why is who's 3D printing toilets? Why? And then I looked into that more closely, and I was completely fascinated by the whole idea that you can do it differently. And so there were a couple of stories that ultimately led to my book. This was one of them. It also won like 2 or 3 awards because it was just so counterintuitive to what we think, and how we think about it all. Yeah.
And that leads me, you reminded me. So that was one of the things that led you to write this book. And what was another thing that inspired you to write this book? Was there something from your past?
Yeah, so it's actually a good question. So I think I had a very untraditional upbringing. So I was born and raised in Russia, which at the moment sounds like a swear word. And it's very sad. My grandfather had 2 degrees, one in agriculture and one in engineering. And so what he did, he operated a small family farm in a very interesting way. So he collected all of our family's sewage in a septic tank, but rather than calling a service to empty it, he would empty it manually once a year in the fall using like those buckets that I showed you, a slightly more modern version of those buckets. And he would distribute it, a little bit of it on the land, just as it was sort of, falling asleep for winter, because nothing would grow in it. So you couldn't contaminate any produce with pathogen. It had to be right before this, the winter and the snow and the snowfall. But most of it actually went into composting piles, and they pits, and they operated on a rotating schedule. Usually, he would close one and let it sit there for 3 years. And when the time came, he would open it up in the spring, and there was nothing left there. Like normally, there'd be, kitchen scraps and, dead plants that we would put there at the end of the season, and sewage. And then when you would open it in the spring, there'd be nothing left there, just rich black garden dirt. and a lot of earthworms were like so heavy and fat because they eaten all this food and they could barely crawl in there. So, and the way he used to say it, you have to feed the earth the way you feed people. And to me, I thought that the whole world lived the same way because it was just such, it was so logical. It was so beautiful. It was so natural. Like this is how it worked. We unfortunately lost our farm when I was 12. It was the Soviet Union. The government did whatever it wanted to do. It took it away. It couldn't protest. And eventually we relocated to the States because my parents were dissidents, and it's a whole different story. So I guess at the end of it, I just can say that we, for the past 30 something years, we look back at Russia and we're hoping that it was going the right path. And of course, all of that completely disappeared and destroyed in the past month. It's very sad.
Wow.
So.
But this book certainly has an inspiring and good memory to it. And it's so great that you were able to draw on that your family history and the inspiration from your grandfather and your family's farm. And now we have you as part of our
as part of your crew. Yeah,
that's right. So thank you so much for sharing your story and your knowledge. I learned so much. It's really an inspiration. So to be continued. And I want to encourage everybody to get the book. Chelsea, can you put it in the chat one more time for us, please? And remember, there's the discount code. I'll leave the chat up so people can find it. Oh, thank you.
I just saw one statement in there that I want to reply to.
Yeah, of course, please.
Craig Hammerman. Sounds like we need to construct a poop line to transport it back to our agricultural centers, which also have more land available for further processing. So it has been done before and it worked. And these concepts were called sewage farms. One of the really successful ones was in Chicago. Well, actually near Chicago. It was a little town called Pullman, after the name of I forget his first name. The Pullman who built train cars. So he also built a sewage farm. So there were pipes coming out of the city and going to the farmland. And that farm operated something like 10, 20 years, and it worked really well. Mind you, back then there were no antibiotics, no Prozac in it or anything, right? It was actually really clean, good fertilizer. And when he died, it fell apart. So we actually do have historical precedents in which it worked, and maybe we can do it before again. Yeah.
Yes. Great. To be continued. Yes. So thank you, Lina, so much. Thanks everybody for joining us. And we will post this recording. We did record tonight's session. We will post it on our YouTube channel. And thanks again for joining us. And if you have more questions, feel free to email us at H2O at info@nych2o. And we'll get the questions to Lina if we can't answer them. And we look forward to seeing you at an event upcoming soon. And we'll have 2 more book talks coming up next month for Earth Day. One about healthy soils, which is a continuation of this conversation, and another about slow water and climate change and managing water resources. So please tune in for those. So thanks again, everybody. Have a great night. Thanks again, Lina.
Bye-bye.